What are you doing? Why are you filming that way? No, we're gonna look like morons if we... Good evening, and welcome to the Stratosphere Report, where we take you above the skyline and into the stratosphere. My name's Matthew Oakley, and I'll be your host. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a few words on why we're doing this program. You see, journalism is a sacred profession, and the Fourth Estate is as important to democracy as the three other branches of government. Chad Nesbitt and Skyline News do not understand this. They do not hold this profession sacred. They deal in half-truths, rumors, and outright falsehoods. This is why we're addressing these videos, to take a stand against bad journalism. So without further ado, we'd like to give you our take on Chad's video about Antifa.
For the first time in history, Asheville, North Carolina had a curfew because left-wing anarchists tried to destroy our beautiful city.
Asheville has absolutely had curfews since its incorporation in 1797, but to address a more specific point, you'll notice an overarching theme in these videos, namely, that anyone who disagrees with Nesbitt's ideology is deemed a left-wing anarchist. But I'll let him tell you more about that.
These anarchists spray-painted buildings, busted out windows, defaced public property, threw water bottles and rocks and fireworks at our police officers. They have tried to intimidate anybody who dared speak out against them. Who was complicit in their crimes? Asheville City Council and Mayor Esther Manheimer. They have allowed these anarchists to block off a city street without a permit and paint "defund the police," costing the taxpayers over $6,000 to clean up and more.
More what, Chad? Ruples? Dinar? Souls? Flowers? You're very unclear on this point.
So who is this Asheville Torch Antifa? How do they get their money? How do they intimidate people? And how can the public stop them?
None of these questions will be answered in Chad's video.
The Weather Underground was a radical left militant organization active in the 1960s and 70s. It was organized by Students for a Democratic Society.
Nesbitt is conflating the SDS and the Weather Underground here. This requires a bit of clarification. You see, the Weather Underground was born out of the SDS movement, though not directly connected with it in any other capacity. The Weather Underground espoused violent tactics that the SDS did not. This is simply a point of clarification, but it's also a half-truth, something we're coming to expect from Nesbitt.
Its goal was to create a revolutionary party of communist socialists and overthrow what they called American imperialism.
This is another one of Nesbitt's themes that he carries through all his videos, namely fomenting the fear of the boogeyman under the bed. In this case, it is communism-socialism, which are two conflicting ideologies, but we'll ignore that for now. From here on out, I'll be referring to this as dumb McCarthyism.
Allies of the Weather Underground was the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panther Party. The FBI classified the Weather Underground as a domestic terrorist group after inciting riots, destroying public property, and bombing government buildings. Who was the leader of the Weather Underground? His name was Bill Ayers.
The leadership responsibilities in the Weather Underground were actually shared between Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, the two of which would later be married. Now, this is just a point of clarification, but facts are important, except at Skyline News.
Ayers and his wife Bernadine Dorn.
And co-leader.
Ayers and his wife Bernadine Dorn became fugitives of the FBI after bombing several government installations. U.S. attorneys dismissed charges against Ayers after it was found that the FBI illegally wiretapped him.
Nesbitt turns his nose up here at the notion of heirs getting off because of a warrantless wiretap. But that is a right afforded to every citizen under the United States Constitution. That's how evidence works, and that is due process. It's one of those pesky inalienable rights that Nesbitt likes to pick and choose from, and who they apply to.
Ayers went on to become a professor and teaches seminars on the tactics of protesting.
The rights provided to you by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution.
What cities does he go to? Seattle, Portland, New York, Atlanta, and Asheville, North Carolina. Mr. Ayers, you were charged for blowing up the Pentagon, or at least sending bombs that way, and you were.
I wasn't charged, but go forward.
Well, and you were also charged with sending bombs toward the New York Police Department out there. Do you think that bombing and hurting people is what these people should do?
I missed that because I'm a little hard of hearing.
But my biggest question is you're telling these people that violence is the wrong thing to do.
I didn't say that.
You did not say that, okay.
There are times throughout the history of the world when violence is the only language that has worked. The Revolutionary War was not a nice sit-down between neighbors, and the Civil Rights Movement was not always amicable, to say the least. To be clear, this program is taking a neutral stance on the degree of violence happening in American streets today, but it is important to provide a historical context for what is going on.
Antifa members will tell you that there is no Antifa, that it's just a movement, but that's simply not true. There are several chapters of Antifa throughout the United States, and where's the one run for North Carolina? It's right here in Asheville.
Earlier in the episode, Nesbitt mentions the SDS and the Weather Underground as kind of the proto-origins of Antifa, or Antifa, as it should be pronounced. This is completely untrue. Antifa actually started in the early 1920s in Italy as a response to the rise of the first of the fascist dictators, Benito Mussolini. There was then an anti-fascist movement, Antifa, as well, in Germany in the early 1930s. Around this time, Antifa actually became prevalent in the United States as well. It was primarily made up of immigrants from those two nations.
An intelligence
Wait, I did forget to mention a fascinating story coming out of England around that same time frame. The Battle of Cable Street was an Antifa response to Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists, who at that time were trying to become major players in the British political arena. As Mosley and the British Union of Fascists marched down Cable Street, anti-fascists from all over the nation, average people, met them head-on with chair legs, table legs, rocks, whatever weapons they could muster to fight this threat to their political system. There were even wives and chambermaids in the apartments above Cable Street who emptied the contents of their chamber pots, toilets, onto the fascists below. It's an absolutely enthralling story.
An intelligence report with the Department of Homeland Security says that Antifa is being investigated as terrorists with ties to Syria.
The report being mentioned here was leaked from the Department of Homeland Security in July of this year. One former DHS official who was interviewed about the investigation likened the way the United States government is investigating its own citizens to the way they investigated Al-Qaeda members. Now, Nesbitt would have you believe that there is some large swath of Antifa supporters all over the nation who have been radicalized by terrorist rebels affiliated with the Syrian conflict. There is absolutely no evidence to support this claim. In fact, the DHS report itself only mentions 6 individuals nationwide suspected of having ties to both Antifa and the Syrian conflict overseas.
Former Asheville anarchist Nicole Sweeney tells Skyline that members of Antifa are trained how to use guns and make bombs in Syria and then come back to the United States to show the Torch Antifa network how to do the same.
There's absolutely no documented evidence of this.
Sweeney says that members of Asheville Anti-Racism, which is part of the Antifa Torch Network, train in Sandy Mush and Black Mountain here in Buncombe County. They even have a Facebook page called the Black Mountain John Brown Gun Club.
The John Brown Gun Club, named for famous abolitionist John Brown, is actually part of the larger Redneck Revolt movement. Redneck, of course, being an epithet derived in the early 1920s to disparage coal miners who were rising up against their oppressors. See the Battle of Blair Mountain. Now, the Redneck Revolt movement espouses Second Amendment ideology. They support open carry, concealed carry, and they also oppose fascism and racism. I can only assume that Nesbitt himself is a Second Amendment supporter, so I'm not entirely sure why he would throw out his own ideology on the Second Amendment just to disparage someone who disagrees with him politically.
Nicole Sweeney says that most of the inciting to riot in downtown Asheville comes from the Firestorm bookstore located on Haywood Road in West Asheville. It is owned by Liberty Valance, but his real name is Evan Scott. In a July 30th post, Evan Scott, aka Liberty, admits to being part of Antifa, and his co-op could be considered part of a terrorist organization.
We'd like to take a moment here to address Nesbitt's constant dead-naming and misgendering of Liberty Valance. Wherever you stand on this issue, it is important to note that journalists are supposed to provide you with the best form of the argument with the facts at hand. They use sources and good faith arguments to give you the story. Journalists do not dead name. Journalists do not misgender. Bullies do it all the time.
According to the IRS 990 Public Information Form, Evan Scott, aka Liberty, has a nonprofit called Center for Participatory Change. The address is the same as Firestorm Bookstore. The form says that Scott's nonprofit received over $293,000 in grant money. And according to mappingtheleft.com, that money came from the Reynolds Family Foundation and the George Soros Foundation.
Despite all of Nesbitt's flashy editing techniques here, it is worth noting that none of what he is talking about is either A, illegal, or B, even remotely suspicious. United States citizens are allowed to donate their hard-earned tax dollars to whatever political cause they see fit. That is what Citizens United was about. And that is what the Koch brothers did for the American Tea Party. I'm not sure why Nesbitt won't draw this line of distinction here, but he seems unwilling to do so.
America is in a fight for the very soul of which it was founded, and that soul is called freedom. There is an evil driving this communist anarchist movement unlike anything America has seen since World War II, and this evil has come for our children.
If there's one thing Nesbitt and I agree on, it's that America is in a fight for its very soul. And that soul is incumbent upon freedom. The freedom to organize, the freedom to fight for what you believe in, and the freedom to hold ideological viewpoints which for the time may be unpopular. What Nesbitt and the Skyline news crew deal in is neo-McCarthyism, boiled down to a word, fear. And to quote Frank Herbert, fear is the mind killer. I think you, the viewing audience, should also know that this reporter did reach out to Chad Nesbitt and Skyline News with these factual corrections on his video. To this date, they have never replied or issued a retraction. So, for all of us at the Stratosphere Report, myself, Chris Hayes, Lee Stafford, we're signing off. Good night. The ball's in your court, Chad.